One of the strangest legends in the Bible is found in Genesis 6. Just 4 verses long, this brief passage says that when the human race began to multiply and have daughters, the sons of God came down and took human wives. Yahweh's response to this was to limit the age of humans to 120 years. We are also told that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. They were the heroes of old, warriors of renown. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? Why did humans bear the punishment for this event? Is this story connected to the story of Noah's flood that follows afterward? It's a passage that brims with unanswered questions. This legend does not stand alone, however. The Nephilim are mentioned in several other passages, sometimes associated with the races of giants who occupy the promised land before the Israelites. 2 groups in particular, the Anakim and the Rephaim, stand out here, and they have some tantalizing connections to the myths of other civilizations. Outside the Bible, the apocalyptic Jewish book of 1st Enoch tells a similar story about angels called Watchers, who long ago descended from heaven and took human wives who gave birth to giants. The 2 stories are obviously connected, but how the Enochic legend relates to Genesis 6 is not entirely obvious. In this video, we'll go back to the roots of this legend and try to trace its development through the ages, guided by up-to-date scholarship in the field of biblical studies. To understand Genesis 6, we first need to examine some other Bible passages that are influenced by similar traditions. One key story is found in Numbers 13. This chapter describes how Moses, having led the Israelites out of Egypt, dispatches 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan, specifically the Negeb and the hill country, and to report back what they find. In verse 22, the inhabitants of the land observed by the spies include 3 individuals living in Hebron, who are said to be descendants of Enoch. Nothing here suggests that these 3 men are physically unusual. However, a few verses later, after Caleb suggests invading the land, the other spies protest. This is their reason. The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. And there we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Enoch come from the Nephilim. And to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Here we are given the additional information that the inhabitants of Canaan are of great size, and this seems to include a group called the Nephilim. The statement that the sons of Enoch come from the Nephilim is almost certainly a later insertion, since it disrupts the text and is missing from the Greek Septuagint. What's important is that, first, these verses introduce the idea of ancient Canaan being inhabited by giants, and second, the Nephilim, whoever they were, are included among these giants. We should remember, however, that Genesis 6 says nothing about the Nephilim having gigantic stature. Another key passage is Deuteronomy 2, where it says the Moabites conquered their land from another giant race called the Emim. The Emim, a large and numerous people as tall as the Anakim, had formerly inhabited Moab, Like the Anakim, they are usually reckoned as Rephaim. A bit further along, the Israelites encounter King Og of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim. Now only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. In fact, his bed, an iron bed, can still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites. By the common cubit, it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So we have 3 important names associated with each other: the Nephilim, the Anakim, and the Rephaim. These groups are portrayed in Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua as the ancient ruling elites of Canaan, and sometimes, but not always, they are depicted as giants. Let's analyze them one at a time. Back in 2018, when I first started MythVision, I was grinding from my desk, sitting down night and day in, day out. It never stopped. Between late nights and long hours, I was really indulging in everything, eating all sorts of stuff, going to the Dollar Tree, eating snacks, and eating really, really good meals. And it was a blast. I enjoyed it, but then reality sank in. Like a lot of you that are out there, I started putting on weight. I started noticing my energy levels depleting and wasn't as satisfied with what I saw in the mirror. I started dabbling with intermediate fasting and really increased my workout, because when you're sitting all day, you really need to exercise, and also started experimenting with how many carbs I'm intaking. The problem was how long it takes to try and figure out whether or not you're on the right track and whether or not you're going to see results. That's why I'm beyond excited to introduce you to today's sponsor, Lumen. Lumen is a revolutionary device that measures your metabolism through a simple breath. It gives you a real-time insight to whether your body is burning fat or burning carbs. If you're burning fat, that's great. You're on track with your health and weight loss goals, you're crushing it. If you're burning carbs, no problem. Lumen gives you personalized goals and options to help you get back into the fat burning mode. So diet, exercise, it gives you these ideas and helps you to achieve that goal simply through your breath. It's smart, it's simple, it's been truly life-changing for me. So if you want to take that next step into improving your health and your life, go to lumen.me/mythvision to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/mythvision to get 15% off your purchase. Big shout out to Lumen for sponsoring this video and helping me get my health back in track, and not just me, but countless others, all simply through a breath. I really appreciate you sponsoring this video. The legend of the Rephaim predates the Bible, for they are mentioned numerous times in the tablets of ancient Ugaritic, where they are called the Rephaim. The Rephaim appear in legendary tales as great ancestors of old, usually kings and heroes, and renowned as warriors. The word was originally believed to come from a root that meant to heal, but some scholars doubt this connection. According to Dean Galbraith, a Bible scholar who wrote his thesis on biblical giants, it more likely comes from a word meaning to be great, and thus the Rephaim were the great ones. Several tablets describe the Rephaim as the divine ones and heroes among men. Some of them are named, such as the well-known King Daniel, or Daniel, who is also mentioned 3 times in Ezekiel, and the name by which the book of Daniel is inspired, that character, goes all the way back to Canaan. As divine heroes, the Rephaim often fight on behalf of other gods, like Baal and Enoch. Despite being described as divine, the Rephaim were not immortal gods. Their special status, as revealed by an Ugaritic text called the Legend of Kurta, comes from being mortal descendants of El and other gods. After death, the Rephaim lived in the underworld as powerful spirits and could be invoked in certain death rituals. One of the Rephaim was said to be enthroned in Athtarat, ruling a place called Hedre. This tradition seems to be reflected in Deuteronomy 1:4, where it says that King Og of Bashan reigned in a city called Athtaroth in Edrei. In summarizing the nature of the Rephaim, Galbraith writes, "What is fundamental to the conception of these Rephaim is that they are great ancestors, usually kings or heroes, renowned as warriors, usually alive within an important founding period, which is the subject of legendary tales." This same dual meaning of Rephaim, both as the ancient elite of Canaan and as spirits of the ancient dead, is reflected by the Bible. In biblical narratives, the Rephaim are always indigenous ethnic groups in Canaan, but in poetic passages, they are kings and heroes of old who now occupy the netherworld, called Sheol in Hebrew. For example, Isaiah 14:9 describes them as former kings of the nations. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. The main change the biblical narratives make is to redefine the Rephaim as entire ethnic groups rather than a class of individual heroes. However, with a few exceptions, they are already extinct by the time the Israelites arrive on the scene. The legend of the giant Anakim might have developed in stages. According to a study of the biblical giants by Dean Galbraith, the earliest tradition about the 12 Israelite spies is the one found in Deuteronomy 1, excluding verse 28. In this version of the story, the spies visit the hill country of the Amorites. They bring back fruit and report that the land is good. However, the Israelites grumble, saying, "It is because Yahweh hates us that he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites to destroy us." Yahweh gets angry and decides the current generation will not be allowed into the promised land. The Israelites then repent and attack, but are defeated by the Amorites. This early layer does not feature the hero Caleb, the Anakim, or giants. The enemy is just the Amorites, and their land is the hill country. Now we must take a brief diversion to the later conquest of Canaan in Judges 1. There we are told about Judah conquering Hebron. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. The Hebronites here are simply Canaanites, and nothing special is said about them. However, at a later point, a new tradition about Caleb was introduced into both stories, the spy story and the conquest story. This tradition is responsible for introducing the Anakim, and so in the spy story, the 3 Hebrionite warriors are reintroduced as Anakim. The spies went up into the Negeb and came to Hebron, and Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the Anakites, were there. And this sets up Caleb's conquest of Hebron later in Joshua. And Caleb drove out from Hebron the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Similarly, in the older tradition of Joshua 10, Hebron, Debir, and the surrounding region are inhabited by Amorites, whom Joshua completely defeats, with no mention of Caleb or the Anakim. But in Joshua 11, Hebron, Debir, and the hill country are instead populated with the Anakim. At that time, Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. In other words, all mentions of Caleb and the Anakim are from a separate tradition that has been inserted into both the spy narrative and the conquest narrative. But who were the Anakim? If they were the descendants of Enoch, then who was Enoch? The origin of the name Enoch remains debated, but many decades ago, E.C.B. McLaurin proposed that it came from the Greek anax, a term meaning Lord, that often referred to ancient gods and Homeric heroes. In many ways, it was the Greek equivalent to the Rephaim, legendary kings and heroes of the land. Galbraith believes that this term was introduced via Greek influence during the Persian period. At first, it was applied only to the 3 legendary warriors of Hebron, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, but eventually the Anakim were redefined as an entire people group inhabiting large swaths of Canaan. You might have noticed so far that the earliest references to the Rephaim and the Anakim say nothing about unusual size. Where then did the tradition of giants inhabiting the land of Canaan come from? The association of giants with legendary heroes and rulers is stronger in classical Greek tradition than in the Near East. In particular, the combination of motifs in which the elite founders of regions and cities possess unusual height and strength is distinctively Greek. In Homer's Iliad, the heroes Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Ajax are easily picked out of the crowd of soldiers by their awe-inspiring size. Herodotus claims that when the interred body of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, was dug up in Sparta, it measured a gigantic 7 cubits, or 10 feet, in length. Indigenous tribes of gigantic stature were also common in Greek literature. For example, in the Odyssey, Odysseus has a disastrous encounter with the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibalistic giants who destroy 11 of his ships and eat many of his men. And of course, there was a famous tribe of uncivilized giants called the Cyclopes, whom Odysseus discovered on another island. And in the Greek epic Argonautica, Jason and the Argonauts had to fight off a race of 6-armed giants called the Gagines. It's possible that ancient Greek legends of giants were prompted or encouraged by the discovery of whale and mastodon bones. There was a third type of giant in Greek mythology, the offspring of Gaia, who battled the Olympian gods for supremacy of the cosmos. This myth, called the Gigantomachy, has less to do with the biblical giants, however. In our case, it is the Homeric motif of giants as ancient elite heroes and foes that matters the most. Galbraith argues that the theme of giants in the land of Canaan primarily comes from these Greek traditions. This theme is incorporated into the narrative of Numbers 13 and 14, not only by making the Anakim and other indigenous races giants, but by making the grapes and the cities of the inhabitants giant as well. Thomas L. Thompson goes even further, saying that the description of Canaan as a land flowing with milk and honey implies that the cows and bees of Canaan must have been giants too. The result is that the spy narrative and conquest narrative contain a complex set of traditions of ancient semi-divine kings and warriors who inhabited Canaan before the Israelites. Gigantic stature is a natural attribute to assign to such legendary figures, though it is not an essential part of their origins. So far, we have seen how the ancient tradition of the Rephaim as kings and heroes of old who resided in the underworld became incorporated into Israelite legends about the original inhabitants of Canaan. Similarly, the Anakim conquered by Joshua and Caleb may have developed from Greek traditions about Homeric heroes. Together with Hellenistic myths about giants, these contributed to the final form of the spy and conquest narratives, in which the Anakim and Rephaim are associated with the Nephilim and are attributed great strength and stature. Now let's return to the story of the Nephilim in Genesis and analyze it more closely. The story of the sons of God and the Nephilim is very short, just 4 verses, all of which are ambiguous in some way. Long ago, the great scholar Hermann Gunkel observed, "The piece is a torso. It can hardly be called a story. The whole thing consists of 3 sentences standing alongside each other in no precise relationship. The original narrative must have been much richer. It is so isolated from the surrounding material that there is no consensus about what source it belonged to. The great Martin Note suggested that it could be an addition to the completed Pentateuch. The first sentence is as follows: When mankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives of them, from any whom they chose." The first question we are confronted with is, who are the sons of God? This phrase appears numerous times in the Bible, particularly in Job and Psalms, where it describes a class of deities who attend God in his divine court. In Deuteronomy 32:8, it describes the patron gods of the 70 nations. In other West Semitic texts, the sons of God, in similar phrases, refer either to the pantheon of gods or to a major group within the pantheon. At Ugaritic, they were the offspring of El and his wife Asherah. The idea of deities mating with human women is quite extraordinary in the context of the Bible. Nowhere else are gods described as having sexual relations with humans. Furthermore, Genesis is uninterested in telling us the nature or motive of the sons of God. As Professor Seaman notes, their sole function in the narrative is to beget offspring. Mixed offspring of gods and humans is not unheard of in Mesopotamian literature. Gilgamesh, for example, was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human. However, this theme is much more widespread in Greek mythology. Sexual unions between gods and human women during the Greek Age of Heroes feature prominently in a work called Catalogue of Women, written by Hesiod in the 7th or 6th century BCE. There are other important parallels between the Catalogue of Women and Genesis that we'll come back to. Professor David Kleins notes that the verb in the sentence is imperfect, which means that the sons of God taking human wives was not a one-time event, but an ongoing situation. As many commentators know, this sexual mingling is not explicitly condemned, and the sons of God receive no punishment in Genesis. This leads to the next sentence, "And Yahweh said, My spirit will not be strong in man forever, for he is indeed but flesh. His lifetime will be 120 years. The narrative is interrupted by a speech from Yahweh, in which he declares a punishment on humans, limiting their lifespan to 120 years. It is strange that Yahweh's intervention is aimed not at the sons of God or the offspring of the mixed marriages, but at the bystanders. It is, to quote Professor Ronald Hendel, a punishment that does not quite fit the crime. Yahweh's punishment might be the most confusing part of this story, yet it also seems to be the whole point of the narrative, explaining why human lives are limited in length. If Yahweh's intention is to implement a form of population control, then this could be an echo of the Babylonian Atrahasis myth, in which population control is the primary reason for the flood. The final sentence of our story introduces the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God mated with the daughters of men, and they bore children for them. These were the warriors of old, the men of renown. So who are the Nephilim? It is assumed that they are the offspring of the gods and human women, though the text does not actually say so. As Seaman points out, if the Nephilim are not the offspring, what is the point of mentioning them here? Their description as warriors of old, men of renown, implies that stories about the Nephilim were well known to the original audience. Unfortunately, their exploits have been lost. The word Nephilim literally means fallen ones. Most scholars take the view that fallen means fallen in battle. Ezekiel 32 explicitly uses the term Nephilim to describe warriors of old as a positive contrast to the Egyptians. They lie with the warriors, the Nephilim of old, who descended to Sheol with their weapons of war. They placed their swords beneath their heads and their shields upon their bones. A derivative of the same word is used to describe Saul and Jonathan after their death in battle. How the mighty are fallen, Nepilu. It is easy to see how the Nephilim were equated with the Rephaim. Both are legendary heroes of old, now descended into the netherworld. The phrase, "and also afterwards," is troublesome, as Seaman observes, not just because it disrupts the flow of the sentence, but because it is proleptic, implying events that have not yet been narrated. One possibility is that it was inserted later to explain how the time of the Nephilim continues after the flood. Indeed, Genesis 6 never tells us when the sons of God stopped mating with women. Its original context may well have been the early history of Israel. On the other hand, if its original context assumed the ensuing destruction of the Nephilim by Noah's flood, then we have a remarkable parallel with Greek mythology. As mentioned earlier, Hesiod's Catalogue of Women described how gods mating with human women had produced a race of semi-divine heroes analogous to the Nephilim. According to that same text, Zeus was determined to destroy the demigods and end the interaction between gods and mortals. His solution was the Trojan War, which brought about the death of the demigods and ended the age of heroes. As Genesis is currently written, the Great Flood fulfills the same role that the Trojan War does in Greek mythology. In a recent book, Professor Guy Darshan describes the parallels between Genesis 6 and Catalogue of Women as startling and points out that there is no corresponding parallel in Mesopotamian literature. However, he cautions that both the Greek and biblical traditions are too incomplete to draw firm conclusions about influence. In Hebrew, Genesis never refers to the Nephilim as giants. However, the Greek Septuagint translated Nephilim as giants, perhaps inspired by the connections between the Nephilim and the other giants in the wilderness and conquest stories. In any case, attributing great size as well as strength to the Nephilim, Rephaim, and Anakim was a natural development of the tradition. The big question for the overall biblical narrative is this: if Genesis 6 is the origin story for the Nephilim, then how is it that they survived the flood and continued to inhabit Canaan? The answer simply seems to be that when the spy narrative and conquest narrative developed, the Pentateuch, with its flood story, did not yet exist. As Professor Helga S. Quanvig explains, in the old traditions about the giant warriors of Canaan, there was no knowledge of giants conceived through an intercourse between heavenly beings and human daughters before the flood. We have no indication that the tradition of the flood was known at all. There was no antediluvian time, only a primordial time. This primordial time was the time of monstrous giants, the Nephilim. In other words, the Nephilim story of Genesis 6 is a story out of place. It logically belongs before the flood, especially if we take the influence of Hesiod and the catalog of women seriously. But the phrase, "and also afterwards," reveals an underlying tension, because the Nephilim themselves are an older Canaanite tradition that has nothing to do with the flood. The imperfect joining of these traditions is evident in Numbers 13:33, where Nephilim is spelt two different ways. The original statement about Nephilim in the land spells it one way, but the additional gloss linking the Nephilim to the Anakim spells it the way it is spelt in Genesis 6, implying some late editing to connect these disparate passages. As the dating of Genesis gets pushed later and later, the conventional wisdom that First Enoch is based on the story of Genesis 6, rather than vice versa, has been called into question by some scholars. A few, notably J.T. Malik, argue that the Sons of God story in Genesis 6 was based on chapters 6 and 7 of First Enoch, while others argue that both are derived from a common source. The original core of the Watcher story seemed to be chapters 6 through 11 of First Enoch, which we shall call the Rebel story. Enoch is not mentioned in this passage and only appears in later chapters. The correspondences with Genesis 6 1 through 4 occur only in a handful of verses in chapters 6 and 7 of First Enoch. However, the lack of any familiarity in Genesis with Watchers and named archangels makes it hard to believe First Enoch was a source for Genesis. Professor Henrik Dronel argues that the overall Rebel story seeks to explain and resolve God's reaction to the events of Genesis 6 1 through 4. However, the Rebel story makes significant changes. In addition to quoting from Genesis, it incorporates a tradition about the Watchers, whose origins are unknown, as a replacement for the sons of God. Dronel says by replacing the biblical protagonists with the Watchers, the Enochic redactors are creating a new narrative to be interpreted on its own terms. They are not interpreting the excised characters. In other words, the Enochic Rebel story isn't just an expansion of the Genesis story. It is a new story that changes the characters involved. It is no longer about the same events described in Genesis 6. Furthermore, the Enochic story does not view the Nephilim positively as warriors of old, men of renown, as Genesis does. It turns them into giants and monsters. Like the barbarian giants of Greek myth, the Enochic Nephilim turn violent, devouring both humans and animals. Dronell argues that the Enochic depiction of the Nephilim and the punishment of the Watchers by binding demonstrates knowledge of Mesopotamian exorcism literature related to a class of demons called the Utaku. The Enochic story also omits any reference to Genesis 6:3, the limit on human lifespans that forms the climax of the Genesis episode, is no longer of importance here. According to Professor Paulo Sacchi, the differences between Enoch and Genesis result from a 4th century schism between two factions of Judaism he refers to as Enochians and Zadokites. The Enochian view is that evil is not human, but heavenly in origin. It comes from fallen angels who taught humans secret arts and introduced the giants into the world. Thus, in 1st Enoch, evil is dealt with by binding the angels underground, by sending a flood to kill the giants, and in its later revisions, by appointing a messianic mediator, the patriarch Enoch. Genesis, however, does not assign the origins of evil to the sons of God or to their offspring, the mighty Nephilim. As Philip R. Davies puts it, evil in the biblical story originates on the earth and with humans. The heavenly world is not the origin of disorder, but quite the opposite. The divine law concerning the tree of knowledge is the authority of the Father, disobedience to whom brings about punishment and alienation from the earth. To the Yahwist author of Genesis, evil is purely the result of human activity, from Adam's disobedience to Cain's murder and the wickedness of the human heart in the time of Noah. In the end, then, the story of the sons of God and the Nephilim becomes a mere side note in the Genesis narrative. For reasons we may never know, the author found it important to retain this briefest of allusions to what must have been once a rich tradition about ancient interactions between the divine world and mortal humans.